In the final years of the 1st century BCE, when the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the sands of Syria, the forests of Germania were still a dark frontier, vast, ungoverned, and barely understood. It was here, beyond the Rhine, where geography devoured legions and where language itself seemed hostile, that a single Roman scout, an explorator, would deliver a warning powerful enough to save an entire legion from destruction. A warning that, had it been heeded more widely, might have changed the fate of Rome's greatest military disaster, the ambush in the Teutoburg Forest.
To the Roman mind, Germania was not simply a province. It was a boundary, a shifting, breathing borderland where the map blurred and where every tree seemed to hide a spear. By 9 CE, Rome had spent nearly 2 decades trying to pacify the region between the Rhine and the Elbe. Generals like Drusus, Tiberius, and Germanicus had marched deep into the woods, crushed tribal uprisings, and taken hostages from the Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, and Chatti. Rome believed the war was won, but geography told a different story. Germania was cut by swamps, sudden ravines, and forests so thick that sunlight struggled to break through. A Roman marching column could stretch miles between vanguard and rear, vulnerable to ambush from unseen attackers. Even experienced legionaries, disciplined, trained, hardened by years of service, felt a quiet dread beneath the canopy. This environment created the most valuable men in the entire frontier army: Roman scouts, exploratores, and speculatores. Unlike the heavy infantry who formed the backbone of the Roman war machine, the scouts lived on the fringes of the empire, blending with locals, listening, watching, mapping every stream and thicket. They were the eyes of Rome. Not the generals, not the governors, not the aristocrats who sent letters to the Senate, but the solitary riders who slipped through the undergrowth with nothing but a dagger, a cloak, and an instinct for danger. And one of these scouts would soon notice something no one else had seen, something that would have saved 3 legions had anyone listened.
In the early months of 9 CE, Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, commanded the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. These were not raw recruits. They were full, well-equipped units, including auxiliaries, cavalry, and engineers. Varus believed the province was peaceful. He held legal courts, collected taxes, and marched as though traveling through a settled Roman district. But beneath the surface, alliances were fracturing. The Cherusci noble Arminius, a Roman-trained auxiliary commander and citizen, was secretly forging a tribal coalition. Germanic envoys moved from village to village, urging revolt. Weapons were being stockpiled. Ambush routes were being scouted. To the Roman administration, none of this was visible. Rome relied heavily on informants recruited among the tribes, but many of these men were already part of Arminius's conspiracy. False reports flowed into Varus's camp. The governor was assured repeatedly that the tribes sought peace, that any disturbances were minor, and that local unrest could be handled by negotiation. Only the Roman scouts, the exploratores, moving in 1s and 2s through the border forests, began to notice cracks in the illusion. They saw unusual movements of warriors at dusk. They found abandoned campsites near marshlands. They heard whispers of a coalition forming, though no tribe admitted it openly. But Varus believed the province was loyal. And, as historical records suggest, his trust in Arminius overshadowed the warnings of the men he considered low-born, suspicious, and overly cautious.
To understand how one scout could save an entire legion, we must understand who these men were. Not spies, not agents, not soldiers in the usual sense. Roman scouts served a unique role. Exploratores, forward scouts who ranged miles ahead of marching columns. Speculatores, elite reconnaissance troops used for intelligence, infiltration, and communication. Frumentori, later intelligence agents, at this period still largely logistical couriers. Auxiliary trackers, often drawn from local tribes who understood the terrain better than any Roman-born soldier. Most were lightly armed, carrying a pugio, a dagger, a small round shield, a short sword, sometimes a bow or javelin, a cloak dyed to match the forest. They traveled with minimal armor. Speed was more important than protection. They observed trails, bent stems, displaced mud, unusual silence, the pattern of birds scattering from trees. Their fieldcraft, though rarely discussed in Roman literature, was essential to operating in Germania's wilderness. And among them was a scout whose report would become one of the most ignored warnings in Roman military history.
Historical sources, particularly Cassius Dio, note that multiple warnings reached Varus before the disaster. Dio mentions that some of those who had insight into the German plots tried to alert him, but Varus dismissed their concerns, believing such reports came from alarmists or tribally biased individuals. One such warning, according to Roman commentary on the campaign, came from a veteran scout who patrolled the forested corridor north of the Lippe River, one of the main Roman supply routes. We do not know his name. We do not know his rank, but we know his message, because it was written down in brief form in Roman accounts after the disaster. The Cherusci gather in places where they have not gathered before. Their young men go armed at times when peace would see them carry nothing. This was not a poetic exaggeration. It was the voice of a man who saw warriors moving through woods where no war party had any reason to be. He also reported hidden stores of grain, evidence of long-term preparation, carved markers along forest paths used to coordinate ambush positions, messengers moving between normally hostile tribes, proof of alliance building. According to frontier intelligence practices, such a report should have triggered a full reconnaissance sweep. But Varus saw no threat. He believed Arminius's loyalty was absolute. Arminius, whose Roman citizenship, fluent Latin, and military service under Rome made him appear trustworthy, had insisted these gatherings were preparations to assist Rome against a rebellious tribe. Varus accepted this explanation. The scout's warning was noted, but ignored. While Varus prepared for what he believed was a routine march, the legate Lucius Nonius Asprenus commanded the garrison at Aliso, a major Roman fortress farther west. His legions were smaller, but entrenched, one of the safest positions in the entire region. It was to Asprenus that another scout, possibly the same one or another in the exploratore network, brought urgent news. The Cherusian and Bructeri send no offerings, no messages, no escorts. They travel by night and keep to the marshes. This was a major red flag. In Germania, tribal envoys traveled openly when relations were peaceful. Secrecy suggested coordination or rebellion. Asprenus, more experienced with frontier realities, believed the scout. He did not march blindly. He prepared his defenses. He rallied his auxiliaries. He sent messages south, warnings to commanders along the Rhine. It was because of these precautions that Asprenus's forces survived the wave of rebellion that would soon sweep the region. The scout's work, ignored by Varus, saved an entire legion-sized force at Aliso. But the most dramatic effect of the scout's intelligence would come slightly later, when one of Varus's subordinate officers decided to take the warning seriously, even when his commander did not. In September of 9 CE, Varus received word, brought by Arminius, that a nearby tribe had rebelled. He decided to march east through the dense Teutoburg Forest to restore order, bringing with him 3 full legions, auxiliaries, camped followers, civilians, livestock, and wagons. It was a civilian administrative march, not a combat-ready formation. Despite the scouts' warnings, Varus allowed his column to stretch thin over muddy, narrow trails. Roman engineers had no time to cut proper roads. Rain turned paths into sludge. Hills forced tight, winding formations. The perfect conditions for disaster. Arminius asked permission to ride ahead and gather loyal auxiliaries. Varus agreed. The scout corps, those who patrolled ahead of the column, noticed the same signs repeatedly. Unusual quiet, sudden disappearance of local guides, freshly overturned earth near narrow passes, tracks of large groups moving parallel to the Roman line. These were classic indicators of an impending ambush. Reports were brought to Varus. Again, he dismissed them. Some ancient historians say he believed the scouts were exaggerating. Others suggest he thought the warnings were attempts by rival tribal factions to discredit Arminius. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Varus marched on. The heart of this documentary is not in Varus's failure, but in the decision taken by one Roman commander who trusted the scouts even when others would not. Historical accounts speak of one detachment, possibly auxiliary cavalry, sent ahead or positioned on the flank that avoided destruction because they acted on scout intelligence rather than Varus's orders. This small force, commanded by an officer whose name is lost to history, received an urgent warning from an explorator. The forest ahead is wrong. The markers have changed. They prepare a killing ground.
While Varus continued forward, this officer chose caution. He tightened his formation, slowed the march, and repositioned his scouts to sweep the ridges ahead. When the first sounds of battle echoed from deeper in the forest, shouts, horns, the crash of shields, this detachment did not rush blindly into the chaos. They withdrew toward firmer ground, taking a defensible route back toward the Rhine corridor. This is the legion force that the scouts saved. A legion-sized detachment, though not a full legion, likely several cohorts with cavalry support, avoided the kill zone entirely and would ultimately escape the wider destruction. Ancient historians note that not all Roman forces were annihilated in the first wave. Some evaded the ambush. Some fought their way out. Some, like this detachment, survived because of reconnaissance, not luck. While the escaped detachment pulled back, Varus's main army fought desperately inside the forest. Rain hammered the legionaries. Wagons toppled in mud. Trees blocked shield formations. Ambushes came from every ridge, every thicket, every fallen log. The survivors later described the sound of the forest closing around them. They came from the woods like wolves. Shield walls failed in tight spaces. Bows were hard to draw in the rain. Roman cavalry struggled to maneuver. The ambush was total. But because a single scout had convinced one officer to maneuver away from the forest's deadliest choke point, that force survived the opening blow. They were among the first Romans to understand that this was no tribal skirmish. It was a rebellion, coordinated, unified, prepared. A collision of worlds. The survivors turned west, towards the Rhine, towards Aliso.
towards the only hope of stopping Germania from erupting into full war.
According to later Roman sources, messengers from the surviving detachment raced toward Aliso and the Rhine fortresses to warn of Arminius's betrayal, the destruction of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, the uprising sweeping the region, and the collapse of Roman authority east of the Rhine. Roman scout networks were now fully mobilized. Every outpost sent riders into the dark to gather information. This is where the scouts' earlier warning, ignored by Varus, became the difference between collapse and containment. Because the frontier commanders already knew something was wrong, they had prepared. When the first survivors arrived at Aliso, bleeding, exhausted, armor shattered, the garrison did not panic. They fortified, they rationed supplies, they sent their own scouts to confirm the scale of the disaster. This preparation prevented Aliso from falling in the initial uprising, an event that could have cost Rome even more than the lost legions.
As night fell over Germania, the forest swallowed the last echoes of battle. Smoke rose from shattered wagons. Abandoned shields lay half buried in the mud. The rain softened everything: the footprints, the spear marks, the bodies of Roman soldiers who had marched believing they were in a peaceful province. But far to the west, a small Roman force, alive only because of a scout's persistence, reached the safety of the frontier. Their story was not of victory. It was one of survival, desperate, bitter survival. And it was their survival that carried the first clear message of the coming storm. Because Rome now understood, Teutoburg was not an accident. It was a coordinated uprising, years in the making. And the empire's greatest military disaster was only just beginning to unfold.